Son insults his elderly mom on the bus. Then a black veteran steps in and changes everything. The morning rush hour had transformed the city bus into a sardine can of impatient commuters, all avoiding eye contact as they swayed with the vehicle's jerky movements. At the front door, Margaret Wilson hesitated, her weathered hand gripping her cane tightly as she tried to gauge the height of the step. At 78, her body betrayed her daily, the Parkinson's making simple tasks into mountains to climb. Before I go on, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, click the subscribe button down below. It would really encourage me to create more videos for you. Thank you so much. Alright, let's continue. Mom, come on, Thomas Wilson hissed behind her, his expensive suit jacket brushing against her faded coat. He checked his Rolex for the third time in 30 seconds. The quarterly projections meeting starts in 20 minutes. Margaret placed her cane forward and attempted to hoist herself up, but her foot slipped, causing her to grab the handrail with both hands. Her small purse fell to the ground, spilling tissues, medication, and a worn photo of her late husband in uniform. For God's sake, Thomas exclaimed, loud enough for the entire bus to hear. The background chatter died instantly. Can't you move any faster? I'm going to be late for my meeting because of you. This is exactly why I said we should have taken a rideshare. Margaret's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as the tremor in her hands intensified. I'm sorry, Tommy, she whispered, using the childhood name he'd long outgrown. The doctor said walking and taking public transport would be good for my condition. From the priority seating section, Sergeant Marcus Reynolds watched the scene unfold, his dark eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his veteran's cap. At 62, his military posture remained perfect despite the shrapnel still embedded in his left leg, a souvenir from a war most passengers were too young to remember. Sir, the bus driver, Elena Vasquez, intervened. Please give her a moment. We're running ahead of schedule. Her kind eyes met Margaret's, offering silent solidarity. Thomas ignored Elena, brushing past his mother to board the bus. I'll get us seats. Just hurry up. He pushed forward without looking back, leaving Margaret balancing precariously on the step, her medications still scattered on the ground. The collective intake of breath from the other passengers was audible. A young woman with purple hair bent down to help collect Margaret's belongings, but froze when a commanding voice cut through the tension. At ease, ma'am. I've got this. Sergeant Reynolds had risen from his seat, his movements deliberate and dignified. He descended the steps with practiced ease, gathering Margaret's belongings with one hand while stabilizing her with the other. Ma'am, allow me to assist you, he said, loud enough for Thomas to hear from wherever he had disappeared to inside the bus. Reynolds helped Margaret up the steps, his gentle touch belying his powerful frame. As they reached the top, he handed her the purse, now neatly packed. Thomas had taken a seat near the middle, his attention fixed on his smartphone, seemingly oblivious to his mother's struggle. Young man, Reynolds called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The bus had gone completely silent now, all eyes on the unfolding drama. That's no way to speak to your mother, or any human being deserving of dignity. He guided Margaret to the priority seat he had vacated. Especially not a woman who appears to have sacrificed a great deal to raise you. Thomas looked up, irritation flashing across his face as he realized he was being publicly called out. The weight of judgmental stares from fellow passengers pressed down on him, but instead of showing remorse, his expression hardened with defiance. Mind your own business, old man. You don't know anything about us. Thomas's words cut through the bus like a knife, causing several passengers to shift uncomfortably in their seats. He turned back to his phone, attempting to dismiss the confrontation with a wave of his hand. Sergeant Reynolds didn't flinch. Instead, he sat beside Margaret, who was staring at her trembling hands in her lap. Ma'am, is your name Margaret Wilson? He asked gently. When she looked up with surprise in her watery eyes, he continued, I served with a James Wilson in '82. He carried a photo of his wife Margaret and little boy Thomas everywhere we went. Said his family was his North Star. Margaret's breath caught. You knew Jimmy? The tremor in her voice matched the one in her hands. She fumbled with her purse, extracting the worn photograph Reynolds had picked up earlier. A handsome man in uniform with his arm around a younger Margaret, a toddler with Thomas's eyes perched on his shoulders. Thomas had gone rigid, his knuckles white around his smartphone. Despite his attempt at indifference, the mention of his father's name had pierced his carefully constructed armor. Memories he'd long suppressed flickered through his mind, waiting at the window for a father who never came home, watching his mother cry when she thought he was asleep, the folded flag presented at a funeral he barely understood. "Your husband saved my life near Beirut," Reynolds explained, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a jagged scar. "Pulled me from a collapsed building during the barracks bombing." He talked about you constantly, how proud he was of his little boy. What would he think of the man you've become? The question hung in the air, directed at Thomas. The bus lurched to a stop, and a few passengers exited, their eyes lingering on the unfolding scene. No one got on. Even those with no connection to the drama seemed reluctant to leave before seeing its resolution. Elena, the driver, adjusted her mirror to watch, her own eyes reflecting a personal understanding of loss. "Before I go on, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, click the subscribe button down below. It would really encourage me to create more videos for you. Thank you so much." Alright, let's continue. Margaret reached out with a shaking hand and placed it on Reynolds' arm. "After Jimmy died, I worked 3 jobs to keep our house," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Cashier in the morning, secretary during the day, cleaning offices at night. Thomas would be asleep when I left and asleep when I got home. I missed so much of his childhood." She looked toward her son, who refused to meet her gaze. "But he got his education, became successful, just like his father wanted." Reynolds reached into his wallet and extracted a faded photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. He held it out to Thomas, who finally looked up. "Your father carried this everywhere. Your little league photo. Said you had a mean fastball." Thomas reluctantly took the photograph, staring at his 8-year-old self in a baseball uniform, his smile missing 2 front teeth. He remembered that day. His mother had been there, exhausted from her night shift but cheering louder than anyone. His father had been gone for 3 months by then. They'd won the game, but the victory had felt hollow without his dad to see it. "I've built a life you would have been proud of," Thomas said defensively, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. Corner office, 6-figure salary, house in the suburbs. What more could he have wanted? But as he spoke the words, Thomas felt their hollowness. The metrics of success he'd been chasing suddenly seemed meaningless when measured against the way he'd just treated his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him those opportunities. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. Instead, he helped Margaret adjust her coat as the bus approached the next stop. When he finally spoke, his words were for both of them. "A man's legacy isn't measured in dollars or titles, son. It's measured in how he honors those who sacrificed for him. Your father understood that. He gave his life for it." A woman in scrubs shifted in her seat across the aisle. "I take care of my father who has dementia," she said, her tired eyes meeting Thomas's. "Some days he doesn't know who I am, but I remember who he is, the man who never missed a single one of my dance recitals." Her quiet confession broke the invisible barrier that had kept the other passengers from engaging. "My mother lives with us now," added a middle-aged man in a construction jacket. "Had a stroke last year. My kids share a bedroom so grandma can have her own space. It's not easy, but family is family." Each word landed like a verdict on Thomas's conscience. Thomas's face flushed with a mixture of anger and shame. You don't understand, he said, his voice losing its earlier edge. She's always put him first, even after he was gone. Our house was a shrine to my father, his medals, his photos, his memory. It was like living with a ghost who could do no wrong while I could never measure up. The admission surprised even him, these feelings he'd buried beneath years of ambition and resentment. Margaret's eyes widened, tears gathering at the corners. Tommy, I never knew you felt that way. I thought keeping your father's memory alive would comfort you, give you something to be proud of. Elena's voice came unexpectedly over the bus intercom. Next stop, Central and 5th, she announced, then added in a softer tone, my mother passed last year. Cancer. I'd give anything for one more day with her, even her nagging about my boyfriend or how I fold towels wrong. She caught Thomas's eye in the rearview mirror. Anything. Sergeant Reynolds straightened his veteran's cap. Honor isn't just a military concept, son. It's not what you achieve, it's how you treat those who gave everything for you. He gestured toward Margaret. Your mother didn't just sacrifice her sleep working those 3 jobs. She sacrificed her grief, carrying it alone so you could have normal. That's courage under fire. A college student near the back of the bus had been quietly filming the exchange on her phone. Now she spoke up. This is going viral right now. 2,000 views already. She held up her screen showing the live stream. People are asking where this is happening and tagging family members to watch. Thomas's phone buzzed in his hand. Then again. And again. He looked down to see notifications flooding in, text messages, email alerts, social media tags. With growing horror, he opened a message from his assistant. Mr. Wilson, are you aware you're trending online? Mr. Kavanaugh has seen the video and requests you call him immediately. Kavanaugh, his boss, whose mother was in hospice care, and who spoke of her with reverent devotion during every management meeting. Another message appeared, this one from a business contact. Is that really you on that viral bus video? Didn't your company just launch that family values campaign? Thomas felt the carefully constructed professional image he'd built crumbling in real time. The irony wasn't lost. On him, he'd spent years climbing the corporate ladder, cultivating the perfect reputation, only to have it dismantled by a moment of impatience with the woman who had made his career possible. I don't understand why you're even going to this doctor's appointment, Thomas said weakly, a last attempt at self-justification. Your hands are going to shake regardless. There's nothing they can do for Parkinson's. But even as he spoke, he recognized the selfishness in his words. It wasn't about the effectiveness of the treatment. It was about his unwillingness to sacrifice his time for her comfort. The exact opposite of what she had done for him his entire life. They're trying a new therapy, Margaret replied softly. But if it's too much trouble, I can take a cab home. The resignation in her voice revealed this wasn't the first time she'd accommodated his convenience at her expense. Reynolds's jaw tightened at her words, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face, waiting to see if the son would recognize the moment for what it was. A chance to begin making amends before it was too late. Thomas's phone rang, cutting through the uncomfortable silence that had fallen over the bus. The screen displayed Claire, with a photo of his wife's smiling face. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he answered, turning slightly away from the other passengers. Claire, I can't really talk right now. I'm in the middle of... I've seen the video, Thomas. Claire's voice was steady but cold, audible enough that Margaret and Reynolds could hear. Your son's principal just called me. Someone showed Jacob the video during lunch. He's in the counselor's office, refusing to come out because kids are teasing him about his dad being the mean guy who yells at grandmas. The words hit Thomas like physical blows. I've been thinking about leaving for months, Thomas. This just confirms everything I've been feeling. Thomas's face drained of color. Claire, wait. But the line had already gone dead. He stared at the phone, the reality of what was happening finally crashing through his defenses. His career was imploding. His marriage was falling apart. His son was suffering. All because of a moment of impatience that revealed the man he had truly become. The bus slowed to a stop near the medical center. Margaret gathered her belongings, her movements painfully deliberate. This is my stop, she said quietly. Tommy, you don't need to come with me. I can manage. She looked at her son with eyes that held no judgment, only a sadness that cut deeper than any accusation could have. Mom, Thomas began, but Margaret continued as if she hadn't heard him. I've been meaning to tell you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I found a nice assisted living facility. Not too expensive. I've been saving from my pension. She fumbled in her purse and pulled out a brochure. placing it on the seat beside him. I don't want to be a burden anymore. I know you're busy with your career and your family. The tremor in her hands seemed to worsen as she spoke, pages from the brochure fluttering to the floor. The brochure showed a sterile-looking facility with stock photos of smiling seniors playing bingo. Golden Sunset Assisted Living was emblazoned across the top in cheerful yellow letters. Thomas picked it up, staring at it in disbelief. You're moving to a home? When were you going to tell me about this? After the appointment, Margaret answered. I didn't want to worry you. They have an opening next month. She looked down at her hands. I've already put down a deposit. Something broke inside Thomas. A dam of emotions he'd been holding back for years burst all at once. Grief for the father he barely remembered, guilt for the sacrifice his mother had made, shame for the man he had become. His shoulders began to shake, and to his horror, he found himself sobbing openly on the public bus, surrounded by strangers bearing witness to his unraveling. I'm so sorry, Mom, he managed between ragged breaths. I'm so sorry. The words seemed pathetically inadequate for the magnitude of his failure. He thought of his son Jacob, hiding in a counselor's office, ashamed of his father. He thought of Claire, who had apparently been silently planning her escape from a marriage to a man who had become unrecognizable even to himself. He thought of his father, who had given his life in service to others while Thomas couldn't even give up a business meeting for his mother's doctor's appointment. Sergeant Reynolds placed a steady hand on Thomas's shoulder. There was no triumph in his expression, only quiet understanding. It's not too late to make different choices, son, he said. Take it from someone who's seen how quickly life can end. The bridges we burn in haste often leave us stranded when we need them most. Margaret reached across the space between them and took Thomas's hand in her trembling one. For the first time that day, Thomas didn't pull away. Instead, he held on as if his mother's touch was a lifeline to a better version of himself, one he desperately needed to find before he lost everything that truly mattered. 6 months later, Sergeant Marcus Reynolds sat in the VA hospital waiting room, flipping through a dog-eared magazine. The shrapnel in his leg was acting up again, a barometer for the coming spring rains. He glanced up as a volunteer pushed a cart of books through the ward, and the familiar profile stopped in mid-page turn. Wilson, he called out. Thomas turned, his face breaking into a genuine smile when he recognized Reynolds. Gone was the expensive suit, replaced by casual clothes and a volunteer badge. Sergeant. Reynolds, he said, wheeling the cart over. I was hoping I'd run into you eventually. The nurses said you come in for physical therapy on Thursdays. What are you doing here? Reynolds asked, gesturing to the cart of books and the volunteer badge. The transformation from the impatient businessman on the bus was striking. Thomas seemed lighter somehow, the perpetual furrow between his brows smoothed away. Reading to the vets in the long-term care ward, Thomas replied, sitting down beside Reynolds. Twice a week after work. He ran a hand through his hair, now flecked with more gray than 6 months ago. A lot's changed since that day on the bus. I've been in therapy, working through my issues about my father. Claire and I are in counseling. She gave me another chance after I took a family leave from work. He pulled out his phone, showing Reynolds a photo of a modest but warm-looking sunroom addition to a house. Mom's moved in with us instead of going to that facility. This is her space. She can watch her garden and have some independence. Reynolds nodded appreciatively. How is she doing? The Parkinson's. He left the question hanging, knowing the prognosis for such diseases. The new therapy is helping with the tremors, Thomas said. But more than that, she's happy. She's teaching Jacob and our daughter Emma about their grandfather. We found all these letters Dad wrote to her that she'd kept. Reading them together has been. He paused, searching for the right word, healing. The word came out rough, as if still unfamiliar in his mouth. From down the hall came the sound of laughter and animated conversation. Thomas checked his watch. That's my veterans writing group. They share stories about their service. Started it after I realized how much military history I never knew, despite growing up with a gold star over our mantle. He hesitated, then added, I'd love for you to join sometime. Tell them about my dad. I'd like that, Reynolds replied, surprised by the invitation. You know, when I confronted you that day, I never expected all this. He gestured vaguely to encompass the changes Thomas had described. Thomas's expression grew serious. My boss saw that video and called me into his office. I thought I was getting fired. Instead, he told me about caring for his mother through her final days, how it was the hardest but most important thing he'd ever done. Thomas shook his head at the memory. We've started a corporate program for employees caring for elderly parents, flexible schedules, support groups, subsidized in-home care options. Turns out my public meltdown became something positive. And your family? Reynolds asked. Claire and the kids? Thomas pulled out his phone again, showing a recent family photo, all of them, including Margaret, at what appeared to be a baseball game. Jacob's team made the playoffs. Mom hasn't missed a game yet. His voice caught. Claire says I'm becoming the man she thought she married. It's hard work, but worth it. As Thomas stood to continue his rounds, Reynolds asked the question that had been on his mind since spotting Thomas. What changed you? Really? Before I go on, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a like, click the subscribe button down below. It would really encourage me to create more videos for you. Thank you so much. Alright, let's continue. Thomas considered the question, his eyes drifting to an elderly veteran being visited by his adult children across the waiting room. You reminded me that the most important things in life aren't the ones you can put on a resume, he said finally. My father carried the weight of honor every day, in how he served his country, his family, strangers he'd never meet. It's time I carry mine. He extended his hand to Reynolds, the gesture bridging the distance between the men they had been on that bus and the men they were now. Some burdens become lighter when we finally have the courage to bear them.